Hey everyone, Sindhu here. I wanted to share some thoughts on BIPOC representation because in recent years we've seen a huge push to diversify leadership and put people of color in positions of power. And rightfully so, because it is so important to diversify leadership in our workplaces that are only becoming more increasingly racially diverse. Representation is so important and it is also needed, but representation on its own just does not ensure inclusion. There are so many amazing Black, Indigenous leaders of color who are really working to be catalysts of inclusion and leading the culture change in our workplaces that we need to see. However, there are also so many BIPOC who sit in leadership positions who perpetuate the oppressive systems of racism and sexism and classism and only exacerbate the toxic workplace culture that they may have been hired to mitigate and change. So rather than uplift and empower and create pathways to success for their direct reports and other minoritized employees, these leaders really are creating harm and traumatizing employees. And sometimes they do a great deal of damage to the organizational culture. So not only is this harmful to the historically underrepresented and excluded employees who are probably so excited to see themselves in leadership, it also sends a negative message about BIPOC leadership to the larger organization. And it can make an organization reluctant to continue their commitment to diversifying leadership based on this one unfortunate experience. And I've seen this happen several times because as a society, we tend to collectivize people of color while individualizing white people. One of the reasons I am ultra passionate about this specific conversation is because I myself have experienced the unfortunate repercussions of having a BIPOC leader who did more harm than good. And I know firsthand just how painful this can be. So the first and only time I had a woman of color leader, the situation was so toxic that I found myself extremely stressed, depressed, and contemplating leaving a career that I absolutely love. The damage that this leader created really left me with deep wounds, and I'm still trying to heal over 3 years later. Zora Neale Hurston tried to warn us about these types of leaders when she said, not all skin folk are kinfolk. And I think it's time that we collectively listen to her wise advice because sometimes leaders of color can create harm and perpetuate systems of oppression that so many of us are working to dismantle and disrupt. This problem isn't only specific to our workplaces. We can look to mainstream media and also specifically politics to understand how electing a person of color into office does not guarantee that they will be advocating for or fighting for the rights of and the safety and the equality of Black, Indigenous Americans of color. Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley are two South Asian Republican presidential candidates who are living proof that not all skinfolk are kinfolk. Vivek has publicly denied the existence of racism, and Nikki has whitewashed our nation's history to appeal to her right-wing voters. We can also look at the infamous example of Clarence Thomas, a Black Supreme Court judge, who since the early 80s has perpetuated anti-Blackness and undermined the systemic racism that has worked to disenfranchise Black Americans. We can also look at leadership in social media to understand this phenomena. In the last 5 weeks, we have witnessed countless BIPOC entrepreneurs, influencers, actors who have built their brands and their fame on the identity politics of being a person of color, stay silent about the genocide of Palestinian people that has been unfolding before our eyes. These folks are leaders, whether they want to be or not, just based on the sheer number of people who follow them and the influence that they have, the incredible influence that they have. The huge social media following that these people have gives them the ability to influence millions, but they choose to be radio silent about the genocide of a brown population that their tax dollars are funding, rather than use their platforms and their voice to be leaders against the destruction and oppression of an entire population. Silence is complicity, and we must refuse to be complicit with the systems of oppression that work to create harm, trauma, and disenfranchise others. When we, as Black, Indigenous people of color, find ourselves in leadership positions, it's so important for us to realize the responsibility that we have to empower and uplift and create pathways for success of other BIPOC individuals. We can and we should be disruptors of a toxic workplace culture rather than be perpetuators of one. And in order to do so, it's so important for all of us to work on unpacking the internalized oppression that so many of us hold, and to reject tokenism and ensure that other minoritized and historically excluded folks have a seat at the decision-making tables of our organization. It's also important to engage in cross-racial solidarity and empower other minoritized employees. And lastly, it's so important for us to question and challenge the policies and the programs and the procedures that might be disadvantaging employees of color and communities of color. I strongly feel that it is our responsibility to be catalysts and gatekeepers of inclusion when we come into positions of power and leadership roles. However, I know that we still have a lot of work to do to collectively understand that our oppression is intertwined and our liberation is bound. So please remember that although it is so important to work towards diversifying leadership, a racially minoritized leader does not always guarantee inclusion or liberation. Thanks for listening.